And a good education teaches the complete person, not just the walking job. You have the whole career to learn how to do your job, but if you think of education as the one time to learn, oh no, I need to think about my life as a whole, that becomes the challenge of education.
Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Mark Townsend, producer. On today's episode, Acton Director of Programs and Education Dan Churchwell talks to James Hartley, Professor of Economics at Mount Holyoke College, ahead of his Acton Lecture Series event. They discuss the discipline of economics and how James came to study them for over 30 years. His lecture, entitled Tariffs, Trade Wars, and the State of the Economy, sifts through the noise of often bewildering claims and counterclaims of economic news. You can watch his lecture at ondemand.acton.org or by clicking the link in the show notes. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line at acton.org/actonline. And if you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
Today we have the pleasure of speaking with James Hartley, Professor of Economics at Mount Holyoke College, where he teaches macroeconomic theory, money and banking, economic growth, as well as multiple courses using the great books, including Western Civilization and Introduction, Leadership and Liberal Arts, and Is Business Moral? He earned his degrees as a California native from UC Davis, his BA, his MA, and PhD in economics. In 2001, he spent 6 months as a Fulbright Fellow in Kolkata, India, and returned to India a second time in 2006 as a visiting professor at India's oldest business school. He gives talks throughout northeastern India and in events organized by the U.S. Consulate. Today, we'll be talking about his life and why he teaches economics the way he does, as well as getting into the topic of a lecture that we've brought him for here to Acton, as what are tariffs and are they good? Well, Jim, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
We're so delighted. Jim, you've been teaching for nearly 20 years at Mount Holyoke College.
Oh, it's actually 30 years.
Oh, almost 30?
I'm older than I look, I guess.
Wow, okay.
So, it's been 30 years.
I dropped a decade for you. So 30 years in the discipline of economics, but you're definitely interested in a broad range of thinking along the lines of great books. And I get to travel quite a bit for my work here at Acton, and I speak with a lot of different economists across the country of many different persuasions, actually. But one theme I've heard, and from a lot of them, when I get into topics like ethical issues or moral issues, issues of virtue, et cetera, many of them say, well, that's not really our expertise. That's not what we do, or we don't have any history of economic thought courses, et cetera. They work through kind of getting back to like, well, we're just econometrics. It seems to be what's dominating the field these days, and it seems like topics of virtue and political theory and those kinds of things are just as important to economics as others. And I noticed that you have a deep love also, you have economics, you've helped with a macro textbook, and you work through these ideas obviously in your discipline, but then you write and think and teach a lot in these great books fields as well. What drew you to that combination?
Yeah, it's interesting. So what drew me to it actually was when I was in graduate school, and it was my second year of graduate school. And all I'm doing is studying economics, reading economics, working through economic models. And at some time towards the beginning of the second year, I thought, my brain's just going to die here if this is all I spend the rest of my life doing. So I thought, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to start spending at least 30 minutes a day reading a book that's just not economics. And it was funny. At first, I'm a student. I'm scared. Can I really find the 30 minutes a day? But it took about a week for it to become an hour a day just reading books besides economics. And what I found is it was like my favorite part of the day because it was like a break from the stuff I'm thinking about and just reading about all these other things. And that's when I started discovering great books. There were all these books I'd heard about, I'd never read, and I just started reading them. And to be honest, I was stunned. They're actually really good, right? It's really fun reading all of these old books that think about all of these larger issues. And what I found was just the pure joy of learning all these things outside of economics became just sort of like this fascinating hobby. And then over time, as I was thinking more and more about them, I started realizing, wait a minute, all these other books actually all interact with economics. And there's actually a much larger world out there. And so that's how I got into it. It was just stumbled into the discovery of the joy of thinking about how economics interacts with all these other things.
I love that. When you got to Mount Holyoke, was that something you were able to help develop? Was that already in the water, if you will?
It was most definitely not in the water at Mount Holyoke. Mount Holyoke, like a lot of schools, one of the things that happened in the academy, and this is an interesting move in the early 20th century. In the early 20th century, disciplines start developing. And so before that, if you were an educated person, you would read widely. And then what happened in the early 20th century is you started getting a lot more advanced knowledge in fields, and then people start becoming specialists in a field. And then over the course of the 20th century, this is why if you're an economist, you only know this very narrow discipline of economics. You don't read old things or broader things. And so Mount Holyoke, like all these schools, everybody's just got these disciplines and these just very, very rigid disciplinary bounds. But one of the things I discovered pretty quickly getting to Mount Holyoke is they don't really have any standards of like what you can't do, right? You're there. And so just by starting to do this, I started by, I do lots of reading groups now with students just reading great books, and then periodically I'd find a way to angle a great books thing into the curriculum through some back door. And this is not popular with most of the people at Mount Holyoke, but, what can they say? And so that's one of those things I always find, I was telling academics this, if you want to do something, and you're on a tenure track job, especially when you're tenured, just start doing it, right? Nobody's going to say no. But it's been funny to me how often, I'll have English professors that'll talk to, and they're really annoyed, like, well, how can you teach Shakespeare, And I'm always like, well, everybody should be able to read and talk about Shakespeare, right? It's not like just owned by English departments. Right. And then they'll inevitably say something like, well, how would you feel if we taught Adam Smith? And I always look at them and say, I think it'd be great if you guys read Adam Smith and talked about it.
No doubt. So. No, that's good. And do you have students, what do you find with the students that you're teaching when you're teaching through great books, and maybe in an interdisciplinary way, or do you work those into some of your raw econ classes? What are some of the reactions that you find students have when they get into a text?
Right, and and the students definitely split, right? So there's a lot of students. In fact, sadly, the majority of students nowadays are in college simply because they want to get through it as fast as possible to go start a job. Mm-hmm. But one of the things I found is the great books are the way to discover all the students that are actually in college wanting an education. So, I have a fabulous time with these reading groups I run or things like that because it attracts the type of student that just wants to sit around and explore ideas, and they love it, right? They love this idea of just, we're going to read these books, we're going to have a conversation about it. There's no agenda to the conversation. We can then think about all the issues that pop up, whatever issues they have or so on. And then I'm constantly dragging in, sort of ideas or things like this from the great books into my economics classes. And again, you see a few students whose eyes light up at this idea of, oh, this is actually kind of interesting. And then a lot of them are just sort of, looking a little puzzled, like, wait a minute, is this going to be on the test kind of thing? And so, but, this is part of the art of teaching, right? Mm-hmm. You've got both types of students in a room, and you want to inspire the ones who want to discover the joy of learning and the joy of thinking broadly across disciplines. But then you teach the ones that are just sort of are trying to maximize a grade on a test too. And, there's only so much you can do for them.
Right. The choices made by students are very interesting. And of course, all the literature and podcasts and right now about the major article that came out, what was it, just 2 months ago or so, about how college students can't read a book.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's so true. I see it all the time now. And, and then they can't read books, they can't read novels, but they've stopped reading textbooks. They've stopped, it's really the collapse of reading is really alarming. They've been doing all these really interesting brain studies, now that they can hook people up. And they're finding that, there was what used to be called the deep reading brain, which is what, people – if you went to school 10 years ago or earlier, right, you develop this at some point in your life, this ability to sit down and do sustained reading. And when they watch people with the brain studies, it lights up areas of the brain. And this current generation doesn't have that at all. They've never developed the ability to have sustained concentration for an hour. So that when the students can't read the books, it's actually physically true, it looks like. They literally don't have the ability to spend an hour in sustained concentration reading a book. And we have no idea what the implications of those be going forward, but it's depressing. It's hard not to be depressed about it.
So even encouraging them just to, having one opportunity with 10 students do a reading group, just absolutely introducing them to one theme. Is good.
No, that's right. And that's why I feel it's always a victory if I can find the students and get them to actually sit down and read a whole book. And there again, I've had lots of students that discover the first time they've ever done this, it's just a pure joy to them, and then they're anxious to read more books and more books. And so, but figuring out how to get that first spark of there's a reward to thinking more broadly and reading more deeply is a big challenge in education right now.
And many people are just afraid of being alone in their own heads.
That's right.
Or interlocutor with just one, the text, and you're engaging. Just being quiet for an hour is hard. It's still hard for me.
Yeah, no.
And we grew up in those worlds where a lot of us read a lot, but now as we've moved beyond that, it's a unique sociological moment. If there was a book or two that you could just teach either every semester or often, what are one or two books that you enjoy working through?
Oh, that's really an interesting question. Dante, the Divine Comedy, fascinates me to no end. That and I think that's one that I would love to just do all the time because of just how intricate it is and how weaving. But I've done the Inferno a lot with students, various things. But it'd be really fun to be able to just do all three of the volumes and sort of just work through all the stuff in Purgatory and and I think students would really love it. But I think it would be hard to convince students to do it. And partly it's the Inferno, and the reason you can do that one is it's very gripping, right? All these tortures and everything, and everybody wants to geek out on those. And then as he moves through, right, it becomes more philosophical, and he gets to heaven, and it's big theological. It is just marvelous. I get so excited, and I'm always telling students they just have to go read this thing and so on. And so that's the one. If I was just going to pick one, I would do all the time, just because of it's all in there somewhere.
Well, and the virtues of the philosophy, the theology that comes out in those, but then the very practical thing, like who's in hell, who's why they're and some of those moves. I think that's a great way to move into. I saw that you also teach and write or interact with the concept of is business moral?
Right. Yeah.
And that's where I'm usually on panels or things in that vein as well. Mm-hmm. So you're an econ guy,
right?
But how do you approach that? What are your favorite ways to engage that? Because it's in the water. Speaking again, that generally business, humdrum business, it seems immoral or inequality, all of those issues wrapped up in is business moral?
Right. And I think that question really fascinated me. And I got a National Endowment of the Humanities grant to design a course on that using great books. And so that was great. And I've thought about it a lot over the years and talked about it in various things. And what interests me about it is there's an interesting separation of this, are people moral? And the answer is no, people aren't moral. And it's, you think about, you hear complaints that, well, capitalism is all promoting greed, but people have been greedy forever, right? It is one of the 7 deadly sins, right?
Pastors are greedy.
Right? Literally everybody is greedy, right? And everybody's full of wrath and pride and envy and so on. And
I've read that somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so there's a lot of this sort of confusing of in a sort of modern capitalist society with business and so on that doesn't eliminate vice, right? It's still there. So then the questions about business and morality part of it is just, are you a moral person or not? And if you're not a moral person, it doesn't matter what society you live in, you're going to act in immoral ways. But I think sort of what we can think of as business is not particularly moral or not moral. A lot of it is just this question of, do you behave in an ethical manner? And if you behave in an unethical manner, the society, has all the brakes, just doesn't have these brakes, and then you can act in unethical. So we see unethical behavior in business. But the deeper question for me is this, is there something about business that promotes it? And I can't find it. In other words, you can live your life, you could be an ethical person, you can sell things, you can think about others, you can be kind and charitable and generous to others in a business setting and in a non-business setting. And so then by trying to separate those questions out about like what's really going on in the business world is very different than what is ethical and what's the right way to behave.
Do you think it also might be, the news cycles or scale? In other words, the ordinary business of life, dropping your suit coat off to get dry clean, it's just humdrum. It's ordinary. Right. It's every day.
Yeah.
And those aren't, don't write about that, but you take advantage of that.
Right.
The average person fills up their car with gas, the whole nine
right.
yards. But at scale, like when I was teaching, I was a professor for 10 years and I taught in a business school. And my first semester teaching, it was kind of the era of WorldCom, Enron.
Right.
Bernie Madoff was in the mix a little bit there later on. And so the scale of when businesses go bad
right.
or things go bad, that the scale of that's what people hear? Do you think that might be a part of it? Or
it could be a part of it, but I think more interesting even than that is the media availability of information, right? Mm-hmm. So if you imagine a lord of the manor in the year 1200 who was thoroughly corrupt, there isn't like mass media. You wouldn't hear about this all over the place. But now, Bernie Madoff, he was running sort of this Ponzi scheme or something like that. Yep. And he robbed a bunch of people of some money. But we all heard the story because it's dramatic and it's exciting. And,
billions of dollars.
There's there's large dollar numbers or things like that. But that kind of scheme has been around forever, right? People have been running those things forever. So there's no doubt that we hear more about it. It feels like bigger numbers because they are bigger numbers. But the fundamental sin here of, just sort of running this basically theft ring is constant through human history. It's just a larger, so you're right, there's a larger scale to it, but I'm not sure there's a larger scale of it relative to all the economic activity that goes on. If you think about like all the economic activity that does that, right, exactly. Yeah. And so, and I think that becomes then part of the we have lost, I don't think there's any doubt, in this culture a lot of discussing ethics, right? Mm-hmm. We don't talk a lot about ethics. We've removed it from a lot of the schools. We're not really, there's too much.
Or making distinctions between legal and
exactly.
Ethical, moral,
just because it's legal doesn't mean it's ethical and so on. And, and too much of the moral relativism creeps in of we deny that there is ethical absolutes. And if you deny there's ethical absolutes, we shouldn't be surprised that some people take that seriously, that, well, if there are no ethical absolutes.
How do your students or the people in your reading groups in that theme, how do they respond? Are they?
I think they get it, right? I think they get it because a lot of times, if you frame it as, are you an ethical person? And then, you ask that of people and they all realize instantly, well, yeah, and I'm not really inherently a completely ethical brain. Everybody's default is I'm a pretty good person, but when you lean on it, everybody realizes they're susceptible to all the 7 deadly sins just like everybody else. And then when you start trying to point out this, okay, you can't evaluate a system just because the people in it aren't necessarily ethical people. And we want to talk about those two things separately in some ways. I haven't met a lot of resistance to that among students or any other groups I've talked to about this.
And I think that builds a little in the philosophical sense, a thicker person, like thicker in connections, thicker, like that interdisciplinary nature of getting them to
absolutely
press the boundaries of those very thin, like you said, specialized disciplines.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's one of the biggest problems of education now is by becoming so obsessively small, and particularly when education becomes career focused, you lose this, as I always tell students, right, you're a 3-dimensional person, right? You've got more to you. You're not a walking job. You're this complete person, and a good education teaches the complete person, not just the walking job. You have the whole career to learn how to do your job, but if you think of education as the one time to learn, oh no, I need to think about my life as a whole, that becomes the challenge of education.
Yeah. For sure. And then one of my favorite essays on this topic is Albert J. Knox, The Disadvantages of Being Educated. Little short 6-page essay where he plays off the idea of the distinction between training and education and then how they work together. So that's just a good distinction for students as well. So, in your discipline then of economics, where what courses are most or themes are most interesting in the courses you're teaching in economics?
Right. So I'm a macroeconomist, and so I like thinking about these kinds of economic problems that affect whole countries. And so there's microeconomics, which thinks about individual markets or firms, but I've always been fascinated by these just larger economy-wide ones. And in that set, the thing that has always particularly intrigued me is all of the money and banking kind of things. Like how much money is there out there? How do financial systems work? What's the effect of money in the economy? And so those are the issues that I got obsessed with those when I was an undergrad, and they've still obsessed me today. It's like,
is that because of like systems? Like what do you have you nailed down? What have you psychoanalyzed yourself?
Right. No,
why that was interesting?
It actually is interesting because that's exactly how I think about my career. Is I started out and I'm really obsessed with this idea of thinking about how do we know how a macroeconomy works? Like what makes a good model? And then over time I began to realize, this question of what makes a good model is a lot like what makes economics an interesting way to frame questions and think about the world, and then that morphs into how do we think about knowledge in general. And so there was definitely that, and I didn't know it was latent in me early on that those are the questions that are obsessing me is how do we find the truth? Like how do we understand things, and how do you put together these big models or things like that, just thinking through things. So it's been a fun thing in my career as sort of I morphed and started realizing that these are the questions that interest me. I've ended up in a lot more interdisciplinary conferences and conversations or things like that where I'll often be the only economist in the room because it's hard to find an economist who wants to talk to people about history and English literature and all these sorts of things. Right. And so it was like this discovery of this really interesting world. And what I found in all of these conversations is because I'm very much an economist, right? This is how I think about the world. What I'm noticing in books or thinking about history is different than what the historians and English professors think about, which is the discipline thing. You learn a discipline, you think about the world a certain way, but you reap so many bigger rewards by thinking about them as they interact. And so I think you're absolutely right. The reason this became attractive to me as an undergrad is because somehow, even at the age of 20, I realized, these questions are big, right? Yeah. These are really interesting, deep questions, as opposed to sort of small questions. You find the answer and move on.
And that was my sense, too, coming to it. Again, my background is more philosophy, theology, ethics. That's the world I've lived in. But then I came into economics through a lot of what Acton did and then some others back when I was in graduate school. And what we find, and now that I'm here full time at Acton, in our conferencing, especially our flagship conference, Acton University, we hold it every year. It's the 20th anniversary this year, so we have a lot of data and thinking through that. It's when people come, there's pastors, theologians, religiously minded people. Usually they're attracted to the economic courses that we're offering. We have 60 courses on offering in the summer. And then a lot of times you find that people that are very discipline specific in economics, et cetera, they're looking to, how they're attracted to the courses of philosophy or figures or history, pieces. And I think what we've really provided is kind of a well-rounded helping people who have not had that in their backgrounds.
Yeah.
Why do you think, I know this is probably a super broad question, but why do you think the discipline of economics has gone so, math-centric?
Right. The math thing starts, again, it's in the early 20th century. There's a few people at the time that start figuring out you can build these models with math. And then what happens is once you can start doing that, then people can start writing even more complicated models with math. And there becomes this sort of, circle of like, well, we've got really, and then you figure out this advanced math, and then you want to make an advance. And so what you do is you take the model and build even more math into it. And then when the statistics get developed enough in econometrics, which is just statistics applied to economics, that becomes the same thing. You find a data set, you can run regressions. And part of what happens then is the rewards in the profession. If you become a professor and you're on a tenure track job and you want to get tenure, the currency now is What have you published in economics journals? And so one of the things that now happens is if you were sort of just interested in economic ideas in general and you're thinking broadly, it's really hard, if not impossible, to now publish results in what we would think of as prestigious economics journals. The easy way to sort of get papers and write things is you sit down, you learn how to do all the econometrics or the modeling, and then you find a small variation on it, and then you just go run a whole new set of regressions. You get slightly different results, and then you can publish that, and that's how you get tenure. So then what happens then in the discipline is you go get your PhD in economics. That's what you learn is how to do that. Then you get a job, and then you need to spend 7 years, doing nothing other than that in order to get tenure. And then by the time you get tenure, and then theoretically you can do anything you want, you've now just spent the last, 14, 15 years of your life focused on exactly this thing. And so then it's hard to broaden out after that moment. And I think you just see this with a lot of economists. I've talked to a lot of economists over the years that would love to do this sort of more broad thinking and reading, but they just don't know how. They're scared about doing it because, if you don't get tenure, then you don't have a job. So it's just the professional rewards. And you see this in all the disciplines, right? The historians are also doing the same thing. They're just finding minute, microscopic little areas of history that they can go find a bunch of archives and do it. And so the broad-based, widespread historian-type class just doesn't exist at lots of colleges now because everybody's too hyper-focused on small issues.
And incentives matter, right?
Incentives matter a lot. No, exactly. They matter a lot. And it would be hard to go to somebody starting grad school in economics saying, well, don't really worry about all the math and econometrics. A, you won't get your PhD, and even if you did, you're not going to get a job. And even if you did, you're not going to get tenure. And so I think that becomes this reinforcing thing. This was something they worried about a lot in the early 20th century when the PhD became a thing. So William James, I think had an essay, The PhD Octopus. And it was just sort of this really interesting idea of if we turn all of college into research institutes, then what are you going to end up with? You're going to end up with narrow researchers. And it's a hard thing. Like, where is the broad cross-disciplinary thinking now? And a lot of it just isn't happening in colleges anymore.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've asked you here to, today you're going to give a broad lecture on tariffs and kind of the state of the union, if you will, economically. And what do you find, when you start to dig around? Obviously, Smoot-Hawley Act comes. You start looking into tariffs. Right. This isn't a new conversation.
Not at all.
1828. You have 1930. Right. When was GATT? Shortly after World War II. Right.
Exactly.
And then in my lifetime, like NAFTA. Right. I remember as a younger man, but remembering the conversations politically, at least on the news, et cetera, around NAFTA. So what is protectionism, or can you just talk about tariffs just briefly? What's going on?
Yeah, the tariff discussion is always a fascinating one, and I love doing this with students too. One of the interesting things about tariffs is Adam Smith, 250 years ago, so next year actually is the 250th anniversary of the Wealth of Nations. So in the Wealth of Nations, he talks about how bad tariffs and protectionism is. And then David Ricardo writes about how bad they are. Karl Marx writes about how bad they are. And in the 20th century, John Maynard Keynes, Friedrich Hayek, and Milton Friedman all write about how bad they are. So this is not like something economists just recently discovered, right? You pick an economist, they've written about how bad tariffs are. So there's this really interesting question. What happens with tariffs is you get this idea that somehow or another, by stopping trade with some other country, this will benefit your own country. And the thought experiment I always run through is, imagine, you pick your hometown, and imagine you only traded with people in your own town, right? And that's it. You never bought anything or sold anything to outside of it. And everybody instantly realizes they'd be a lot poorer. And then if you expand that to your state, well, then that's better. And then you expand it to the whole country, it's better. But somehow or another, as soon as you expand it to Canada or Mexico, people are like, oh, no, that's just too far. But the principle is the same. The larger the trading market, the wealthier we'll be. But people keep coming back to this idea that somehow or another, we collectively within the nation will be wealthier if we can just stop buying these products from people in other countries. And we know that's not true. We know that levying the protectionist measures, actually the harm done by causing higher prices and lower quality, of a variety of products and the amounts and so on, actually makes you worse off. But what's interesting is there's actually a beneficiary of the tariffs, and it's the industry on which you levy the tariff. So you take the aluminum and steel things, and we have the really good data on this now. So in the first Trump administration, they levied these tariffs. And because of the tariffs on aluminum and steel, there's now roughly 1,000 more jobs in manufacturing in those industries in America. And so then that's when people talk about, well, that's what we want. We want to create that 1,000 jobs in aluminum and steel. But what's fascinating, and people miss this part of it all the time, is because of the tariffs, aluminum and steel prices in the United States are 40 to 50% higher than the world price for those. So it costs more to buy them. Now, most of us don't buy aluminum and steel, so we don't notice that it's gone up. But there are lots of manufacturing firms in the United States that do buy aluminum and steel. They've actually lost jobs because of the higher cost. And the estimate is there's been about 75,000 fewer jobs in manufacturing because of the aluminum and steel tariffs. So you pick up 1,000 jobs in aluminum and steel industry, you lose 75,000 other jobs, and that becomes then the problem. The aluminum steel industry loves the tariffs. They advocate for them. They're happy to give campaign contributions or so on. All the people that don't have jobs now in manufacturing don't even know that's the reason they don't. And so there's just nowhere near the sort of lobby to sort of get rid of the tariff. The beneficiaries of the tariff have way more interest in getting the tariffs than not. And so you end up with policies that do collective harm, but because there are well-defined beneficiaries, the political system generates a lot of these tariffs. And so that's why we have them, is because there are well-defined beneficiaries, and it's silly to pretend there's not. Sometimes people ignore that. But the beneficiaries are way smaller than the widespread costs, but the widespread costs are diffused, spread out over lots of people, and so you don't get nearly the political pressure to get rid of them.
So a lot of our listeners are going to be very familiar with like what a tariff is.
Yes.
But for those that aren't, just describe, kind of give us a definition of why are tariffs a conversation?
Right. Tariffs are a tax, and that's all they are, and they're just a tax on imported goods. So the way it works is, if a good is produced overseas or in a different country, then what would happen is as it's coming into the country, the government levies a tax on it, and so then the person bringing it into the country has to pay a tax to the government to bring it into the country.
So let's break it down really simple too. So if something costs, let's call it, you used aluminum earlier, $10 a pound. Or
yes.
What would then? So a tax would be what would be a percentage would be added on?
Yeah, most of them are framed as percentage. So if you had a 20% tax on that, then what would happen is the good's going to cost $10 bringing it in, and so you pay a $2 tax on this good as it comes in.
So it's now $12.
Well, that's what's interesting. When you levy the taxes, and this is true not just of tariffs but all taxes, what happens when you levy the tax is the price goes up, but somewhere between nothing and the say $2. What happens with taxes is you could think of it just any tax. If you had a good that cost $20, then what that means is there's no tax, right? Somebody pays $20 and the person selling it receives $20. Then if you levied a $5 tax on that, what will happen is the amount being paid has to be $5 more than the amount being received. But what ends up happening is it depends upon the market. The good may end up costing $23 and the supplier receives $18. It could be the good costs $24 and the supplier receives $19. Or, any kind of range in there. And we know this from taxes. It varies by the nature of the good. So the same thing happens with tariffs. You levy a $5 tariff on this good. The price will go up somewhat to the purchasers between $0 and $5. The supplier will receive between $0 and $5 less. And so that's why you get all of this who pays this thing is it depends upon the good.
I think it was just yesterday or maybe the day before. There was a press conference and there was a major debate and somebody was arguing in the political administration that tariffs aren't taxes.
Right.
What is that? Do you think that's just a fundamental misunderstanding? Is that a bait and switch? The person that was making it seems to be quite smart, so it shouldn't be made. But
the charitable interpretation is it's somebody who doesn't understand what a tariff is, right? They're unambiguously taxes. If you think of a tax as the government is charging you and then they're collecting the revenue from it. So they are fundamentally taxes, and there's really so. I think some people may not get that. And that, like I said, that's the charitable interpretation. The uncharitable is, he knows they're taxes and he's saying they're not. But I'd prefer to be charitable if possible.
Oh, of course.
So,
it's so fraught, right now, even talking about this topic, even though, like you said, it's 250 years old, it's in the literature everywhere down the line.
Right.
But right now it's very prescient and in our minds. But what about when you think about like the topic of protectionism,
Right.
why is usually that's mated with the concept of tariffs?
Yeah.
Well, how are those linked?
So a tariff is one form of protectionism. You can get other ways of protectionism, like you just don't let other countries sell goods in your country, right? That would be also. So protectionism is just an old word for all the different ways we try to stop countries from selling goods within the country. It's a popular idea among people who don't know enough economics to think through all of this stuff, which is why, before Adam Smith, it's easy to see how somebody didn't get like what would be the problem of this. And then Ricardo, like I said, he wrote the book on it, right? And so it's easy to see how people before those eras would have been confused about it. It's harder to justify now, like not understanding. I mean, this idea of what protectionism is and what tariffs are and how they work is in every single intro to economics textbook. And they're all the same. And it doesn't matter who's writing them, how conservative or liberal or whatever. It's just, you can just see in the pictures and all the data is there. But I think that sort of idea resonates. And this is a lot related, I think, to the questions you were asking earlier. Lots of people don't know intro economics because if you go to college and you're a history major or politics major or so on, you don't learn economics. And then you go off. And then if you get into positions of power, you may never have really learned economics. And so if what you're hearing is, oh, these are all great, lots of people think, well, they must be all great, and there's no downside to them. And so that, I think, is part of the failure of economists insofar as economists have abandoned we're trying to talk out to everybody and we're all writing for each other. It allows the idea just to sit out there that somehow or another protectionism helps your country. And it's really hard to tell stories about how it helps your country collectively. Again, you can find the individual beneficiaries, but you have to ignore the costs that are being spread out through the society.
Let me ask you so I grew up out west, and a lot of family and friends are in farming and ranching still to this day, and several good close friends of ours, in soybeans out west, and they're probably I would think it's fair to say they're probably supporters of the current administration.
Right.
But then in the last week or so, all the saber rattling. I mean, who is our Brazil is our number one competitor with soybeans. Right. But who is the major importer? That's China.
Right.
China is taking our soybeans.
Right.
And so when we say, we're gonna, it seems like a battle quickly happens when any president, because again we've seen historically this has happened in multiple presidencies. Right. But in the current one, it's simply, we're going to tax these kinds of imports coming inbound. Well, then within 24 hours or less, okay, well, we're going to tax. And in China, it was specifically soybeans, meat, these kinds of commodities. Doesn't that just breed immediately? I mean, I guess, what happens historically with trade partners? And of course, Canada and Mexico are now at the front edge too. So it seems like it's Canada, Mexico, and China that are the ones that are in the forefront of the news currently. What do those other formerly trade partners, or it seems like it's like goodwill is not happening, and so what will they end up doing?
Right. Yeah. Now this is the problem when you get into the trade war thing. We decide we're going to protect a few industries, and so we levy tariffs, and then all the countries that are affected say, well, we're going to retaliate by levying tariffs, and then we retaliate again, and you end up with this. And we see this periodically in history. All the countries just start ramping up all their tariffs, and you can go from a low tariff world to a high tariff world. What's really amusing,
which affects all of us,
it affects everybody, and everybody's losing. So when you levy the tariff, you lose if you're the country levying the tariff, and then the other country loses too because they also get restrained. So the tariffs are just all-purpose harm, right, for everybody. And then when you get into the tariff wars and we start raising them more and more and more, you get more and more and more harm. And then periodically what happens is, and these were all those trade agreements, the GATT thing and the NAFTA thing, they get up to a point and then everybody sits down and says, okay, this is clearly getting bad for all of us, and so we're going to negotiate a free trade deal. And what's interesting about the free trade deals is you think, how long would it take to negotiate a free trade deal? Well, it should take about 30 seconds. We'll get rid of all of our tariffs, you get rid of all your tariffs. But these agreements take forever because everybody starts with, okay, we'll get rid of all the tariffs. Well, except the soybean tariff. I mean, clearly that's vital to our national interest or something. And then the other country says, okay, yeah, we'll get rid of all, except the banana tariff or something. And so then the free trade agreements end up being these large, takes forever to broker, like which tariffs are we all going to allow in this free trade thing. So then you never quite get rid of all the tariffs. And then that starts again this whole process. We've got the tariffs and then we decide, oh, we're going to protect one more industry and then they're going to, and then we just ramp them all back up again. And as I said, right, it's hard to sell this as a benefit to either country. It hurts both. When you have the big tariff lowering things, you end up seeing lots more economic activity in all of the countries. This is one of the things people just suddenly discovered because of the NAFTA agreement. U.S. car manufacturers have lots of parts being made in Canada and Mexico, and then they're bringing them all in. So you levy a tariff on all of those parts, and suddenly the U.S. manufacturer car prices go way up.
And this isn't hidden information.
Exactly. We knew this would happen. It was obvious. We knew it was going to happen. And then it happened. And so when those tariffs got levied, Ford Motor Company is on the phone instantly like, you're going to crush us here. And so we get rid of that. And then everybody else realized, oh, well, if you're going to get rid of them for all the cars, then we'll get rid of them for everything. And so, this massive tariff on, Canada and Mexico got wiped out within 48 hours when everybody realized, oh, this is actually going to hurt all of the domestic firms too. And but what's interesting is we didn't get rid of it. They just put them on pause for 30 days. So we're going to have the same conversation 30 days from now.
Yeah.
So
is it, you look at some of these, they seem to, and here's where I guess where the interdisciplinary nature should come in to some of this, because it looks like, the Smoot-Hawley Act in particular and 1828 as well, and GATT, they're all around a historical event.
Exactly.
Or they're responding to
something,
to cycles and again, we have, if you're a mathematician and you study systems and cycles, et cetera, this should be almost, we've have enough data from a couple hundred years, if you will, and we've seen what has happened. And expecting different results. It just seems so. Isn't that the definition of insanity?
Yeah. Now there is a lot of that, but I think this is where again the economists in me always want to say, but you have to remember there are people who benefit from the tariff. And in other words, if the people who benefit from any given tariff, right, they are really interested. It's a really, if you think of it as like if you're a business, if you could get the government to tax all your competitors but not you, you would love that tax, right? And so I think that becomes the sort of political part of all of this. If it's there because there are people who benefit from it, and the people who benefit are, they go to senators, congressmen, president, and they're like, this will really help us. The interesting thing about these recent discussions is, when the tariffs were just on Canada and Mexico instead of on goods, that's a little unusual that you're just trying to levy the tariff on a major trade partner. And then it suddenly starts hitting lots of industries in different ways. Instead of the aluminum tariff or the steel tariff, which at least the steel firms and aluminum firms can say, okay, I know who the beneficiary is. Right. But these broad-based, we're just going to tax everything coming in from Canada. It didn't take long to realize, wait a minute, all my intermediate goods I'm buying to produce products are suddenly 25% more expensive. And that's a disaster for me, the American manufacturer. And so I think that becomes what's interesting of how do people even lose sight of if you're going to apply tariff to benefit somebody, maybe we should make sure somebody's benefiting first. And it's not obvious who's benefiting from the broad-based tariff.
Yeah. And it makes business people think differently. I was just in conversation with a very good friend of mine last weekend, and they manufacture quite a bit. They've been to China, or they do work in China and Vietnam, Taiwan, and figuring out which countries. And they have one major product line in China, one major product, in these different places. But they're like, we might literally have to leave China.
Right. Yeah.
And he was, very real percentage-wise. He was giving me numbers, and wow, I think a lot of us don't. Sometimes we don't have conversations with the people that are actually dealing with the raw number.
Yes. No, exactly.
I can't import this good anymore.
Right.
7%.
No, exactly. I have a friend who runs a smallish paper company in Holyoke, Massachusetts. And, there was suddenly this tariff. It was on South Korea a few years back, which basically almost wiped them out because, the imported products they're using to make paper in Holyoke, Massachusetts are coming from South Korea, and it was just devastating for them, And that's the kind of thing people lose sight of is because we take advantage of all the specialization in trade. When you start disrupting that, you suddenly have this really hard transition time where you either have to pay more for the imported goods or you're going to have to find new suppliers. But there's a lot of firms that can't afford to spend 6 months to a year trying to figure out how to get their cost structure back down.
New R&D
exactly. They can get
logistics.
wiped out in the meantime, right?
Yeah.
And and that's the 75,000 job loss kind of thing. Is just firms that could not adapt fast enough to a changing economic landscape like this. And because the tariff things always just sort of show up and suddenly we're going to have them, it's not like we know, well, we're going to levy this tariff 2 years from now. So you have 2 years to figure out how to readjust. It's just they show up. You had a 1 month notice. You didn't even know that this was going to happen.
So is it essentially then maybe this is a rhetorical device, but is it a weapon? Aren't tariffs weapons essentially?
In a real sense, they are. And I think that becomes an interesting thing about tariffs. And I really realized this in the first Trump administration because he was using tariffs there sometimes for completely non-economic reasons. And that was really interesting to me. And the case that really sparked my interest was there was a pastor in Turkey who had been, arrested on false trumped-up charges and so on. And so then Trump took up this case and he levied these massive tariffs on Turkey because they were holding this pastor as a prisoner. And then Turkey released the guy. And so it was and then Trump got rid of the tariffs. And it was that moment I realized, wait a minute, this isn't tariffs for any of these traditional reasons of helping. It's like we're going to try to punish you because we don't like your political behavior. And then if you do that, well, then maybe they'll modify their behavior. And it got me really thinking, is it okay to do this thing that we know causes harm for political reasons? And as I thought about it, I realized, this is kind of an interesting trade-off question. And I realized there's the old Catholic doctrine of just war, which is exactly the same thing. War is bad. We all know war is bad. But sometimes it's okay to go to war, right? Sometimes it's perfect. So I thought, well, what if you took Catholic war doctrine, just war doctrine, and you transferred it to tariffs and thought about, what would a just tariff look like? Mm-hmm. And then you think about it and you realize, there might be things, but it has to be things like the harm being done by the tariff has to be less than the harm that you're trying to correct. And, you've got to make sure that there's a reasonable chance this thing will succeed. You got to have a plan for it to end. You got to make sure that it's not vulnerable people. If it's only hurting widows and orphans, that's bad. And so if you think about tariffs like that, you could imagine creating an ethical case for using tariffs as basically a weapon, and they'd be justified, and we could do that. But, and I wrote this up, sketched it out, and it got no traction. And I realized the reason it gets no traction is the whole idea of a just tariff assumes you start with tariffs cause harm. Yeah. And if you don't start with tariffs cause harm, well, then, of course, you will never have to justify them as, if they're just a good thing. But there may be an argument for tariffs to use them for political purposes. But it would be really nice if the people that want to use them for political purposes were thinking through all of these sorts of ethical considerations first before deciding when it's appropriate to levy these tariffs. And I think what we're getting is if you deny the harm, you use them for political purposes, but they're just completely outsized. They're not necessarily even related to the harm. They may be causing more harm and all of these sorts of things. And then it gets really hard to justify them for political purposes.
And it seems like it would lead to economic mad, mutually assured destruction.
Absolutely.
Everybody's It seems like an eighth grade third grade fight on the playground.
That is literally what a trade war ends up feeling like. Oh, you're levying tariffs on me. Hey, I'll show you. I'll levy tariffs on you. It's like Europe just announced, I think it was 99 different products, and why 99? But it's just sort of this weird, and then Trump's going to respond to that, and we'll maybe we'll do 149 or something, and so then it all does this, and in the back of everybody's mind there may be we'll just keep levying these things until we hit a point, and then we'll get together and negotiate getting rid of them all. But in doing that, you're ignoring all the real harm to real firms and the people that are going to lose their jobs in the next month because of all of this sort of trade, and just ignoring all of that cost makes it hard to justify on an ethical ground.
Because even for a month, let's just say it's a month, people are tasked.
Exactly.
Strategists, business analysts, they're all like, okay, how do we adjust? How do we respond?
Right.
And then it turns out to nothing.
Yeah.
Well, then for 30 days, people have been...
Right. There's this really fascinating, it's an economic policy uncertainty index, right? And so one of the Federal Reserve banks reports this thing. And that goes back to 1985, and it's just trying to capture how uncertain people feel about policy. And the big spikes, all right, are in September of of 2008 when Lehman Brothers fails and the whole world's melting.
Was that a big day?
Yeah, it was a huge thing, and nobody knew what the government was going to do. So you see a big spike there. You see a really big spike in March, May of 2020, which again, nobody knew what was going on. And then there's one other big spike, and it's now. And you think, this isn't an economic meltdown, right? It's not a big pandemic. Like, why are people as uncertain as those days? And because it really does feel like nobody really knows what policies are going to be a month from now or 6 months from now. And that level of uncertainty is crippling if you're a business. Because, if you're trying to think, should I expand a product line?
Right.
Should I build? You don't know. Even in things like if I'm thinking, should I build a factory to build the parts that Ford wants that they're importing? Like, I don't know if I could try to build it and then we don't end up with the tariffs, in which case I don't compete and I go out of business. Or maybe it would be the smartest decision. And so that level of uncertainty all by itself creates huge harm in a society when people just don't have the ability to predict the future. And we see this a lot in small, poor countries where if the political situation is really unstable, you've got civil wars or things like that or threats of revolution, economic growth just doesn't happen in these countries because of all the uncertainty. And it is alarming that we are now experiencing levels of uncertainty that look a lot like major problem eras, even with the absence of, like I said, the financial crisis or the COVID crisis.
My friend in manufacturing, the plant they chose in China, they had to choose it because no one in America makes the literally if they wanted to.
Right.
Made in America is the big and I think it's cool, right? There's nothing wrong with that necessarily.
Yeah.
But they literally right now there's not a single manufacturer that would be able to make their products.
Exactly.
And then they went to China and it was even a unique problem for them. And so they had to retool, and it took them about 6 months to get up to speed. And like you said, the risk. So they're putting capital on the line. They're putting investments in, and obviously not foreseeing some of these things.
Exactly, not knowing. And I think that's the other thing that people lose in the protections things is there's just a lot of things that are not cost effective to make in the United States. There was a fascinating article in the Wall Street Journal within the last week about avocados, right? Mm-hmm. So Americans love avocados. American avocado growers do not have the capability of growing enough avocados for all the avocados people want to buy in America. So we buy them from Mexico because they can grow lots of avocados in Mexico. We couldn't do that if we wanted to we just couldn't. And so there's an interesting thing, right? You start taxing avocado imports. Who wins here? It's not like you've got a bunch of avocado growers in America that are going to be celebrating, right? They're already
An interesting sidebar with that is the major avocado manufacturers in Mexico are all cartel.
Yeah, exactly.
Owned by cartel,
literally,
the drug
exactly. The drug cartel. No, exactly. And it is this. That's another interesting part about all of this, which again would think about like all the trade kind of implications and. What do you do? Who benefits from that, and so on, right?
So let's you said you like strategy and macro stuff. So let's back it up even further. Is this essentially just one of the downsides, and there are many, many good sides of globalization?
Right.
Isn't this just a
Yeah, I think it could be thought of that way. The problem with globalization is it's not clear what people are worried about with globalization, right? In other words, I'm a patriotic American, right? I love this country. I love everything about this country and so on. I would not want to live in another country for the rest of my life. But that's an interesting thing about so you do this. Then what should my reaction be of interacting with people in other countries? And that's where I think the economics of trading with people in other country, I'm glad when people in other countries specialize in goods. They allow me to I can be a college professor here because I don't have to grow my own food and build my own house and do all of these things. And so it's really good when all of these people in these countries are specializing and then we're trading for it. This is a massive benefit to us. And so the globalization is just expanding the size of the market. And that is a good thing. But when you do that, you can always find these isolated cases of this company used to be here in this town, and then they opened a new factory down in Mexico, and now they've got a factory in Mexico. And if you only concentrate on that part of the larger story, then it looks like globalization is this bad thing because it's removed the job. But what we don't see in that one story is, and then what else are we producing here that we're now selling to people in the rest of the world? If we had shut all the borders, we'd just be producing different things and we'd be poorer. So you have to have this perspective of saying, you start doing all of these things. There are huge benefits, but there are small costs, right? I mean, in other words, and I think this is one of sometimes the proponents of globalism sound like they're ignoring the fact that something changed and, some guy lost his job in a factory. That's not good for that guy. We don't have to pretend it's good for him. There may be enormous benefits to the society as a whole, but for the guy who just lost his job, that's really bad. The same thing happens with technological change, right? You improve technology and, the buggy whip makers who may have been great making little buggy whips to make the buggies go around. When the automobile gets invented, they are out of a job, right? And so, again, we know this, that, economies being dynamic mean jobs will be eliminated, new jobs will be created, and we don't have to pretend no jobs were ever eliminated, but we do want to step back and say, is there a net gain here? And I think that's the thing with globalization, is it's a net gain for America to be involved in this globalized economy, even though there will be costs for particular factory owners or particular workers or things like that. But by denying that, then we don't focus on the problem. I mean, there may be really interesting ways that we could think, if we were creative, how do you help the people that were living in the factory town where the factory closed down? That is a legitimate kind of thing that I think we as Americans should take seriously.
Speaking of moral.
Right, exactly.
Because Neil Postman argues in that technological change arc that there's nothing there's always change, winners and losers in economic change or technological change,
right.
And there's nothing irrational about loser resistance.
Exactly, right.
And he
it's perfectly rational, but I think because the sort of proponents of technological change and globalism don't want to ever admit there's a cost, we don't spend enough time thinking, wait a minute, we've got fellow Americans here, right? I'm benefiting from this bigger economy and there are more things and more specialization, more income. There are people who lost here. Is there something we could collectively do? And this is a huge part of the charitable impulse thing, right? Charity is a good thing. Being helpful to people who are in need is a good thing. But we've lost a lot of that sense. And part of the problem with the charity thing is when it wipes out a whole town, then suddenly you're out of a job, but all your neighbors are out of a job, all your friends are out of a job. And it's all well and good to say, oh, look, there's all these jobs elsewhere. But what if you don't want to move, from Michigan to Tennessee or California or wherever, your whole roots are here. Is there things that could be done that could help the sort of losers in this thing? And we spend way too little time thinking about that. We again, you get people that are just looking for broad-based programs that'll just help people in general. In the aggregate, and they don't actually do anything here, or you get people that deny there's the cost. And so, again, when you're thinking about the ethics of the business, I think that's another huge aspect of it is, why aren't we spending more time thinking about the sort of depressed areas that are actually suffering legitimate harm, and thinking, is there something that could be done here, and what would it look like? How would we do it? Sometimes it might even be more cost effective than the sort of programs we have right now, if we could think of the more targeted things.
So I don't know if you, in this same vein,
right.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but Mark Levinson, the gentleman who wrote the book The Box, about the 40-foot ocean going.
Absolutely.
So he did a follow-up book in late 2020 or early 21 called Outside the Box. Where he was engaging, we're kind of, some people argue we're in the fourth industrial revolution. Well, he's arguing we're in the fourth stage of globalization.
Right.
And he argues that the new globalization is moving from goods and goods to primarily services, information, and ideas.
Absolutely right.
Do you? I mean, when you talk about somebody who's in Appalachia, in coal country,
right.
And this was 10 years ago now.
Yeah.
But you remember the narrative that they said, okay, well, we'll reskill.
Right.
And if you remember, it was trade coal for coding.
Yeah, exactly.
And now we have 10 years of history, or 15 years actually, 15 years of history where that was a failure.
Yes, absolutely.
And they have numbers of the people and they're not dumb people.
Right.
That wasn't what they wanted to do. But millions and millions of dollars were funded into companies that would go down there and do these job trainings. And so reskilling is important, but also cultural. And that's just more, it's costly, isn't it?
Oh,
to care.
Right. It is costly, and that's the kind of thing that you can imagine academics sitting in an office. Like, everybody should just like to sit around an office and think of big thoughts or something like that. And so you take guys that are coal miners. You imagine you're a 45, 50-year-old coal miner, right? And then we say, gosh, we're going to teach you to sit in a room with a computer in front of you and spend 8 hours typing code. And you're like thinking, this isn't the life this guy chose, right? I mean, he was a coal miner, right? And that's a hard job. No academic could ever go work in a coal mine. And then you imagine if you flipped it like that, you said, oh, we're going to take you academics and we're going to retrain you to be coal miners. You'd instantly see the problem, right? They're incapable of going into a mine and doing all of this stuff. So this sort of fantasy that will just flip everybody's job and they'll be just as happy doing this other job, even though it looks nothing like their first job, and somehow or another they're going to be really productive at it and so on. It is just this bizarre, again, this idea that people are just sort of these little anonymous cogs and we can just take them out of here and plug them into there, forgetting, no, there's a whole culture here, there's a whole level of education, and, this is what a day's work should look like here, that when we're 16 thinking about our careers, we're all choosing careers that match our interests or something where we live. And then, just trying to say, well, now you're 50, we're going to switch you over to this other job. It is doomed to failure every single time. But, people that are sitting in nice little offices just imagining I had a great experience. I'm teaching a course this semester on economic growth and just sort of what makes, how do you turn poor countries into rich countries? And the models we're working through are all about, this idea of you need people doing research and technological research. And we are definitely, according to all the models, there's not enough people doing this. And so all the students are like, yeah, this is really true. We need more people doing research. So I said, okay, so how many of you are interested in a job where you're going to be doing economic research? Like, we need more, right? So you guys, not one of them was at all interested in the job of going into working in a chemistry lab and inventing new drugs or any of the kinds of other technological research would do it. And it was interesting. It's like you're thinking, well, what if I told them all, this is what we want you to do because this will benefit everybody? It's not how they want to spend their life. And so one of the great things about living in a free country is they don't have to go do that. But this idea that we could just plug everybody in, yeah, it's never going to work like that.
And the ability to opt out, like I was at a conference recently and I was sitting in on a panel and there were two younger people and it was all about artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
I like to study and talk about the future of work.
Right.
That's a place I've been playing for the last decade or so. And obviously right now, artificial intelligence, general intelligence, all of it is the buzz.
Yeah.
And the two people on the panel that were under 30,
right.
One of them was a very highly educated, impactful lawyer in the tech space.
Right.
But her answer when this general idea came up, especially about older generations and AI, I think it was Marvin Minsky that said artificial intelligence is a suitcase word.
Right.
It needs to be unpacked.
Yeah.
Like what are we like tariff? Like what are we actually talking about? And so I think some people just don't even understand all of it, even the people that are in the industry.
Yes.
And she was just said, yeah, the answer is for the older. It was an older person that had asked the question, and she said, yeah, you just need to learn.
Right.
You just need to get in there and use it and figure. And so and the gentleman was like, I don't want, like I don't see. And then she's like, well. If that and she was kinder than that, but essentially what she was saying is, well, you're going to be left behind.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that just seems wrong-headed on several levels. Mm-hmm. Because there are people in this reskilling, deskilling this conversation, whether it's coal miners and coding or whether I mean it seems to be more the default for many people in the technological age. That it seems like they miss the cultural cues.
Right.
Is that what do you think? I mean, I don't necessarily have a major question there, but I'm hearing this as I'm out and about in the world.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think it's clever to think of it as the cultural cues, right? They're just missing the fact that new technologies are disruptive, right? And we shouldn't pretend they're not disruptive. They are enormously. We learned this at the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. That's what the Luddites were, right? They were people who were going around smashing the factories because they thought, hey, we're all going to be out of a job. Now we know in hindsight. We don't have 95% unemployment. We find new jobs all the time, right? We get new industries, new jobs. The same thing will happen with AI, whatever this means and whatever it will do. 50, 100 years from now, people will have different kinds of jobs than they have now. But that's not surprising, right? That, it's hard to imagine we freeze the current economy and pretend 100 years from now we'll have exactly the same jobs doing exactly the same things we have now, right? This is the nature of dynamism, and this is why people in the future will be richer than us.
Sure.
And that's great. But it's no doubt about it. You just get these catch-all like AI is just going to replace everything. And then, like what are all the new jobs that'll be in AI? And you should all just go be specialists in these new jobs. But nobody even knows what the new jobs will be. And so, there was a Wall Street Journal article, I don't know, maybe a year or so about all the great new careers there will be for people in the AI world. And the number one was like people who know how to ask the right questions of the AI thing. And you're thinking, that's not really a job, right? Like, how do you train to like be a question asker, a prompter of AI? Exactly. I'm going to take a while. I'll learn all. And so, but then people feel this uncertainty, and acknowledging the uncertainty of, yes, this is an uncertain world, but then also remembering, for the most part, over the next 10 years, most people will be able to live their lives just like they've been living them and never have to interact with AI at all. I mean, it's going to be disruptive in lots of ways, but that does not mean every single person's life is going to be overturned and all your jobs are going to be eliminated or things like that. We don't really know what will happen in this world. The coding thing is the interesting one. One thing that it may very well eliminate is low-level coding, right?
Of course, it already
because
is.
AI can do the code pretty fast compared to a human, and so all of these people that trained to be coders, because we were all told that was the wave of the future, but they're just sort of average or below average coders. Not everybody's the best coder in the world.
Right.
Those are literally the people whose jobs may evaporate. And then you think 10 years ago they were being told this is the wave of the future, and then suddenly we find out, it wasn't the wave of the future after all. And then what are all those people going to do? And I don't know, right? I mean, they'll probably end up doing all sorts of things.
Yeah. Two comments on that. One is one of the best books on this is Carl Benedict Frey, the economic historian at Oxford. His book, The Technology Trap.
Right.
He argues that, and he's tech optimist. He's economic optimist. He thinks this is all good. But his book, I think the reason it won many awards is it shows that it takes 2 to 3 generations, kind of piggybacking off Postman's quote.
Yeah.
That there are going to be losers.
Right.
And he just details through historical movement the losers.
Right.
And the revolutions that kind of happened from that.
Right.
And so I want to push back just a bit to you on your point about it wasn't the Luddites that they were merely – there's good evidence now and good writing in a couple books on this that back to the cultural cues, they were most disappointed about because the looms were changing. It wasn't just – faster work. Right. It wasn't just the machinery it was changing their entire way of life. Right. The way the villages worked, the way the women and kids worked. It was a culture. And so for myself, as I'm thinking through, it's these cultural cues that the technologists or the people with technique are beginning to look at or miss. Excuse me. Right. They're just missing. Right. And so and they're not necessarily wrong. Right.
Yeah,
but they don't get the whole picture.
They don't, right?
And that's just an area that is really near and dear to my engagement with this topic.
I think it's a really important point. And, this is one of the things being economics trains you is you think about like costs and benefits all the time. And that's exactly what you're describing here is there are tremendous benefits to the technological change,
Absolutely.
Right? I would not want to live in one of those, villages in the 1600s. I mean, life was hard in those villages, and I'm glad that we're not living like that now. So the benefit of the new looms and all of that is massive for all of us, but there is a cost to the people whose entire way of life has just been destroyed. They liked their way of life, and they don't reap the benefit of living in the 21st century, right? They never had the penicillin, right? And all of these. I mean, they didn't have all
public
that.
health and sewers,
and they never had sewer. They never had any of that. And they don't have cell phone. I mean, their life was thoroughly disruptive, and this was hard for them. And I think that's one of these things that, and this gets back to the globalization question, the technological question. So something that gets missed because, you get economists who are just thinking about the economics of it or technologists who are just thinking about the change. They're missing there are also larger cultural impacts here. And if you ask people and talk to them, it turns out the cultural things are more important to most people than the sort of technological advance. They like this idea that this is my network, this is my set of friends. And one of the things we find is as those cultural things get disruptive and people start leading these lives of, you imagine the person that just is bouncing around from city to city to go find the new hot job in the new industry, they never have a community and they are literally bowling alone, right? I mean, and this is exactly this collapse of this cultural network, I think is what a lot of people are feeling when they complain about globalization or the technology technological change. It's not the economics of it. There's this other thing here that's actually really important to them. And we don't spend enough time talking about these cultural kind of disruptions and what are the effects of those and what could we do to help people like that. And it's not teach the coal miners how to be coders, right? We need a lot. And we don't have an answer because I think the space of people thinking about it is way too small. If you really wanted to be thinking about how to help people in the future and do that, this I think deserves way more attention. But there's not a discipline attached to that. Mm-hmm. And so this becomes, again, part of the problem of how do you think about this. This is the reason places like Acton Institute are so important, right? Because it's actually forcing conversations between thinking about religious life and economic life and how these things interact, because those conversations don't normally happen outside. And we need more of that, sort of bringing in the people to have these real discussions about how these really seemingly disparate things, when you start thinking about them, you realize, oh, they're not that disparate. They actually are really the same question.
Very interconnected. Yeah. Well, Jim, this was an absolute delight. Thanks for sharing your insights on general economic theory and your interests. But we'll link when this podcast is dropped. We'll link the lecture as well to this, so people will be able to see what you're delivering here about tariffs specifically. But thank you for joining us in the studio today, and we really appreciate you being here.
Oh, it was generally my pleasure. Thank you for having me, and thanks for all the work you guys do. You guys do great work.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important because it lets us know what topics you are interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at producer@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Mark Townsend.